What happens when a corrupt cop thinks he's untouchable, until he makes the biggest mistake of his life? A judge who won't back down. A system built to protect the powerful. And one moment that changes everything. This isn't just a fight for justice, it's a war against the untouchable. Stay with us, because this story is just getting started. Olivia Carter had lived in Minneapolis long enough to understand its contradictions. The city prided itself on progressive values. Yet just beneath the surface, a different reality pulsed. One where systemic injustice thrived in the shadows. She had seen it firsthand during her years as a civil rights attorney. Fighting against police misconduct in courtrooms packed with silent judges and defensive officers. When she became a judge herself, she had hoped to change that. But change, she quickly learned, did not come without resistance. The crisp autumn air carried the distant hum of traffic as Olivia parked in front of her modest but elegant brownstone. The leaves had begun to turn, a mix of amber and deep red carpeting the sidewalks. From the outside, her life looked stable, successful, even. A respected judge, a comfortable home in a quiet neighborhood, a career built on integrity. But stability was an illusion. She turned off the ignition and sat still for a moment, watching her reflection in the rearview mirror. A deep sigh escaped her lips before she grabbed her briefcase and stepped out. She barely noticed the cool breeze against her skin as her mind remained occupied with the case that awaited her tomorrow. One that had already stirred controversy long before it reached her courtroom. Officer Travis Holt. The name alone carried weight. He had been accused of excessive force multiple times but had never faced real consequences. This time, though, there was video evidence, and public pressure was mounting. It was supposed to be a straightforward hearing. But Olivia knew better. Cases like this rarely went as planned. She climbed the steps to her front door, keys in hand, when a flicker of movement in the corner of her eye made her pause. Across the street, parked beneath a dim streetlight, sat a patrol car. It had been there last night, and the night before that. A slow, measured inhale. Olivia hesitated before turning the key in the lock, stepping inside, and securing the deadbolt behind her. The warm glow of the living room lamp did little to dispel the unease creeping through her. She placed her briefcase on the kitchen counter and poured herself a glass of water, fingers gripping the cool glass as she stared out the window toward the street. The car was still there. She wasn't imagining things. She set the glass down and exhaled, pressing her fingertips against her temples. She had dealt with intimidation tactics before, anonymous threats, aggressive cross-examinations meant to shake her resolve, but this was different. This was personal. Her phone vibrated against the counter. A text message, unknown number. No one challenges the system without consequences. She read the words twice, the weight of them settling in her chest. Whoever sent it knew what they were doing. The wording wasn't overtly violent, but the message was clear. They wanted her to doubt herself, to reconsider her role in what was about to unfold. She deleted the message and locked her phone. If they thought fear would silence her, they had chosen the wrong woman. The soft hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the kitchen. Olivia rubbed her temples again, exhaustion threatening to pull her under. But sleep was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. Instead, she reached for a file on the counter, flipping it open to the case notes on Holt. His disciplinary record was longer than most defendants who came through her courtroom. Complaints of excessive force, falsified reports, even allegations of intimidation. Yet he remained on the force, untouched, protected. The system had shielded him for years. Tomorrow, that would change. She closed the file, her jaw tightening with resolve. If this was their way of warning her, she had one for them. 2. She wasn't going anywhere. The night had settled over Minneapolis with a quiet that felt deceptive. Streetlights cast a dull amber glow on the pavement, their flickering reflections dancing across Olivia's windshield as she drove home. The day had been long, but her mind remained sharp, replaying the details of the case she would oversee tomorrow. The weight of it pressed against her shoulders. Officer Travis Holt, a man whose uniform had protected him from consequences for far too long, would stand before her. She turned onto a less traveled street, a shortcut she often took when the main roads were crowded. The city felt strangely still. That was when she saw the headlights in her rearview mirror. Close, too close. A sharp burst of blue and red filled the car. Her pulse remained steady as she signaled and pulled over. Hands on the wheel, she exhaled slowly. This was routine for too many people who looked like her, innocent yet treated with suspicion. But she wasn't just anyone. She was a judge, and she knew the law better than most. The crunch of boots on pavement signaled the officer's approach. Olivia didn't need to turn to know who it was. A deliberate pause, then a knock on the driver's side window. She rolled it down smoothly, meeting Holt's gaze. His presence carried an air of manufactured politeness, the kind that came wrapped in arrogance. "Evening, Your Honor," he said, the title slipping from his lips like an insult rather than a sign of respect. "Officer Holt," she returned, her voice even. "Is there a problem?" "Routine stop," he said, making sure everything's in order. Her hands remained still on the wheel. "And what exactly prompted this stop?" Holt let the question hang in the air, as if savoring the moment. Then, he leaned in slightly. "You shouldn't concern yourself with things outside your reach." The statement, so casually delivered, held more weight than any shouted threat. He wasn't here to enforce the law. He was here to remind her of the rules he played by. A car slowed as it passed, a driver taking a moment too long to glance their way. A figure on the sidewalk hesitated, phone in hand, eyes darting between Olivia and Holt. Someone was watching. For a moment, Olivia considered speaking louder, making sure every word was captured. But she knew how these situations played out. "Am I free to go?" Holt studied her, then stepped back, tapping the roof of her car. "For now," he said. She didn't wait for anything further. With controlled movements, she rolled up her window, checked her mirrors, and pulled onto the road, leaving him standing in the glow of the flashing lights. But the warning sat heavy in her chest. As she turned onto her street, her phone buzzed on the passenger seat. A text. "No number. You don't run the law. You just borrow it." She gripped the wheel tighter. Holt hadn't been there to stop her. He had been there to send a message. The air was colder than usual when Olivia pulled into her driveway that evening. The day had dragged on longer than expected, filled with case files and legal briefings that blurred into one another. But despite the exhaustion creeping into her bones, something unsettled her. A lingering sense of unease that had clung to her ever since the encounter with Holt the night before. As she climbed the steps to her front door, she reached into her bag for her keys. The porch light flickered overhead, casting long, shifting shadows. It wasn't until she slipped the key into the lock that she felt the slightest resistance. A hesitation. The door wasn't quite flush against the frame. Her pulse quickened. She pressed her palm flat against the wood and pushed gently. The door gave way, opening an inch without resistance. She hadn't left it unlocked. A deep breath. She nudged the door open further, eyes scanning the dimly lit interior of her home. Nothing seemed out of place. No shattered glass. No overturned furniture. No sign of struggle. But something felt wrong. She stepped inside carefully, leaving the door ajar. The living room was untouched. Her books still lined the shelves in their meticulous arrangement. The coffee table sat precisely where she had left it. But the silence was heavier than usual, thick like a storm cloud waiting to break. Then she saw it. The deadbolt on the inside of the door hung askew. Scratches along the metal where something had been forced inside. A break-in. But there was no sign of anything missing. Her stomach tightened. If this had been a robbery, something, anything, would have been taken. A laptop, a piece of jewelry, even a few dollars from the jar near the entryway. But everything remained exactly as it was. Untouched. This wasn't about theft. It was a message. She turned on the lamp beside the couch, trying to steady her breath. Then she saw the paper. A small, folded note, placed carefully in the center of the coffee table, as if the intruder had wanted her to find it immediately. She picked it up with careful fingers, unfolding it. "Remember who really holds the power." A chill ran through her. She knew who was behind this. Or at least, she knew whose hands had delivered it. Holt had played his games before. But this was different. A broken lock, an open door, a silent warning. She had expected pushback after issuing the court summons. But this was beyond intimidation. This was a clear attempt to remind her of the rules. The ones that protected men like Holt. The ones she had spent her entire career fighting against. She inhaled sharply, willing her pulse to slow. Calling the police was the logical next step. But the bitter truth was that she couldn't trust them. Even if the officer responding wasn't in Holt's pocket, the report would land on someone's desk. Someone who might conveniently forget to follow up. Instead, she reached for her phone and dialed the one person she knew would listen. Marcus Fields answered on the second ring. "You don't call me after hours unless something's wrong," he said, his voice gruff from a long day of dealing with the legal chaos of the city. "I need to see you," she said. "Tonight." There was a pause. Then, "My office. 15 minutes. She grabbed her coat and left the house, locking the broken door behind her. The district attorney's office was nearly empty by the time Olivia arrived. The overhead fluorescents buzzed faintly, casting a sterile glow over the tiled floor. Marcus was waiting for her in his office, a man perpetually caught between doing the right thing and keeping his career intact. He looked up from his desk as she stepped inside, taking in the tension in her posture. "You look like hell," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Someone broke into my house," she said bluntly. "Left me a note." Marcus's expression darkened. "And you think it was Holt?" She slid the note across the desk. He read it once, then again, his jaw tightening. "This isn't just him," he muttered. "Holt's a foot soldier. He doesn't act alone. Someone's backing him. And they want you to know it." She folded her arms. "Then it's time we start looking at who's pulling the strings." Marcus exhaled, rubbing his temple. "That's easier said than done. You're not the first person to try and take down someone like Holt. But I might be the first to succeed," she countered. He studied her for a long moment, then reached for a folder on his desk. "There's something you should see." He slid the file toward her, and she flipped it open. Inside were photos, timestamps, reports, evidence of what she already knew but hadn't yet seen for herself. A grainy video still of Holt, his badge glinting under a streetlight, his fist raised mid-motion. A young black man, arms up defensively, moments before impact. "That was taken 3 weeks ago," Marcus said, right before he filed a falsified report claiming the suspect resisted arrest. Olivia clenched her teeth. "This isn't the first time," Marcus continued. "There are more complaints, eyewitness accounts, use of force reports that went nowhere. Every time, the case gets buried before it reaches a courtroom. And every time, Holt walks away clean." Her fingers tightened around the edges of the folder. "If this gets out, it won't just be Holt on trial," she said quietly. "It'll be whoever's been protecting him." Marcus nodded. "Which means whoever they are. They'll do everything they can to stop you from using this." She closed the file, her resolve solidifying. "Then we make sure they can't." Marcus sighed. "This won't be easy, Olivia. You know what happens to people who push too hard." She met his gaze. "I know exactly what happens. And that's why I won't stop." A tense silence filled the room before Marcus finally nodded. "Then let's get to work." Outside, the city stretched out beneath the darkened sky, lights flickering in office windows and street corners. Olivia knew that somewhere in the shadows, someone was watching, waiting for her to back down. But she had no intention of doing so. The morning air carried a sharp bite, signaling the arrival of winter. Olivia stood by her office window, staring out at the city she had spent years trying to serve. Minneapolis had always been a battleground between justice and corruption. And today, she was stepping into the fire. She had made her decision last night. There was no turning back. At precisely 9 a.m., Olivia signed the court summons for Officer Travis Holt. The document was simple but carried enormous weight. Holt would stand before her in a formal hearing, his record of misconduct laid bare, his actions dissected under the scrutiny of the law. She placed the file in a sealed envelope and handed it to her assistant. "Make sure this is delivered immediately," she said. The young woman hesitated, concern flickering across her face. "Are you sure about this, Judge Carter?" Olivia met her gaze. "This isn't a decision I made lightly." The assistant nodded and hurried out, leaving Olivia alone with the quiet hum of the city beyond the glass. She had barely sat down when her office phone rang. Marcus Fields didn't bother with pleasantries. "You just painted a target on your back." She leaned back in her chair. "So I've been told. You think Holt is dangerous? You haven't met the people protecting him." There was a pause. Olivia tapped a pen against the desk, considering his words. Who am I up against? Marcus? A heavy sigh came through the receiver. I got a call this morning. Not a friendly one. Some well-connected people are unhappy about this case moving forward. They're digging into your past, trying to find anything they can use to discredit you. Olivia clenched her jaw. Let them dig. It's not just that, Marcus continued. I heard whispers that certain political figures want this case buried. They don't want a scandal tying the police force to corruption. She exhaled slowly. Names? Marcus hesitated. Deputy Commissioner James Calloway is one of them. He's been covering for Holt for years. There are others, but he's the one pulling the strings inside the department. Olivia had expected resistance. She hadn't expected them to move this fast. Are you saying you won't back me on this? She asked. Marcus's voice softened. I'm saying be careful. The system has ways of protecting itself. She glanced at the sealed summons on her desk. Then let's see what happens when we force its hand. That afternoon, Olivia made her way to the courthouse. Her steps steady despite the undercurrent of unease settling in her chest. The weight of the decision she had made pressed down on her. But she carried it the way she always had, with determination. As she stepped into the marble-floored hallways, a familiar voice stopped her. Richard Lawson, the courthouse's chief bailiff, stood near the entrance, his arms crossed over his chest. The man was a fixture in the legal system, grizzled, experienced, and unshakable. You've been busy, he said. Olivia gave him a measured look. I assume you heard. He nodded. I hear everything that happens in this building. There was something unreadable in his expression. You know, he said, lowering his voice. You're not the first person to try and bring Holt down. She stilled. And? Lawson's gaze was heavy. And none of them are here anymore. A cold sensation crept down her spine. What are you saying? I'm saying be smart, he sighed, glancing around before meeting her eyes again. I've seen how this plays out. Cops like Holt don't operate alone. There are people in high places who have a vested interest in keeping him exactly where he is. Then that's exactly why he needs to be held accountable, she said. Lawson studied her for a long moment, then shook his head. Just don't make the mistake of thinking the law will protect you. She appreciated the warning, even if she had no intention of backing down. Before she could respond, her phone buzzed. A message from Marcus. The witness is missing. Her heart lurched. She turned back to Lawson. When was the last time you saw our key witness for the case against Holt? Lawson frowned. Yesterday. He was supposed to testify. Right? Yes, Olivia said, already moving toward the exit. And now, he's gone. The evening sky had deepened into a muted gray by the time Olivia stepped out of the courthouse. The day had stretched longer than she expected, filled with tense discussions, legal maneuvering, and the lingering worry of a missing witness. Her conversation with Marcus earlier still echoed in her mind. They were fighting more than just one corrupt cop. The entire system was designed to protect men like Holt. She unlocked her car and settled into the driver's seat, exhaling slowly. The weight of it all pressed against her. But she wasn't backing down. As she pulled out of the parking lot, the streets were quieter than usual. The rush hour traffic had thinned, leaving only the occasional passing car. She barely made it 3 blocks before the sharp wail of a siren split through the still air. Blue and red lights flared in her rearview mirror. A traffic stop. Her fingers tightened around the wheel. She signaled and pulled over to the curb, hands steady but mind racing. It wasn't Holt. She could see that much as the officer stepped out of the squad car. Adjusting his utility belt, he was younger, his expression unreadable beneath the dim glow of the streetlights. She rolled down the window, keeping her posture relaxed. Is there a problem, officer? You were driving 15 miles over the speed limit, he said, his tone neutral. Olivia's brow furrowed. She knew for a fact that wasn't true. She had checked her speedometer the entire drive. She forced a calm breath. That's not possible. I was going exactly the speed limit. The officer didn't react. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as if listening to something over his radio. Then, after a pause, he straightened and said, "Step out of the vehicle, please." She blinked. "Excuse me?" "Step out of the car. Judge Carter." It wasn't a request. A chill crept up her spine. But she kept her face composed. "I'd like to know why before I comply," she said carefully. "Routine vehicle search," he replied, Standard procedure. Her jaw tightened. There was nothing routine about this. She hesitated. Another squad car pulled up behind the first. 2 more officers stepped out. Their movements quick and efficient. Like they had been expecting this. One opened the trunk of their patrol car. She knew what was coming before it even happened. A trap. With no other option, she reached for her phone and started recording as she unbuckled her seatbelt. The second she stepped out, one of the officers took the device from her hands. "You won't be needing that," he said. She opened her mouth to protest. But before she could, they were already searching her car. Then, as if on cue, one of the officers let out a triumphant sound. "Got something here," he called. She turned her head sharply, watching as he held up a small, clear plastic bag filled with an unfamiliar white substance. Her stomach dropped. "You have got to be kidding me," she said under her breath. The first officer let out a low whistle. "Judge Carter, do you want to explain why there are narcotics in your car?" Her pulse pounded against her ribs. This was it, the setup. Her mind raced through possibilities. She could demand a forensic test, argue that there was no evidence linking her to the drugs. But it wouldn't matter. The headlines would write themselves before the truth had a chance to catch up. "That's not mine," she said, voice steady despite the fury burning underneath. The officer didn't even blink. "Then you won't mind coming with us." One of them reached for his handcuffs. Her breath hitched. A handful of people had gathered on the sidewalk, watching. A woman pulled out her phone, recording. Olivia felt the weight of their stares. The way they hesitated, uncertain of whether stepping in would put them at risk. 2. This wasn't just about her. It was about power, about fear. And right now, the system was reminding her who had the upper hand. She refused to give them the satisfaction of resistance. She lifted her hands as the cold metal snapped shut around her wrists. "Careful now," the officer murmured as he guided her toward the squad car. Wouldn't want the judge to trip. The last thing she saw before being pushed into the backseat was the woman on the sidewalk still filming. Her face a mask of silent outrage. But Olivia knew what the news would say in the morning. Judge Olivia Carter arrested in drug possession case. No mention of Holt, no mention of the corruption case. They had been planning this from the start. As the doors locked around her, sealing her inside, she kept her chin high, her jaw clenched, because she knew exactly where they were taking her. And she knew who would be waiting. The holding cell smelled of stale sweat and disinfectant, the kind of scent that clung to the walls and settled into the cracks of the floor. Olivia sat on the cold metal bench, her hands resting in her lap, her breathing slow and measured. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, casting a sickly glow over the concrete walls. She refused to let the situation break her. The rhythmic tap of footsteps echoed through the hallway outside. She lifted her head just as the heavy steel door swung open. 2 uniformed officers flanked the entrance. But it was the man standing between them who held her attention. Travis Holt. He stepped into the room like he owned it. Like he belonged here more than she did. And in a way, he did. This was his territory. The place where men like him thrived. Shielded by the very institution meant to hold them accountable. He leaned against the table in the center of the room, arms crossed, his expression one of lazy amusement. "I told you, Judge Carter," he said smoothly, "you may control a courtroom. But out here, I am the law." Olivia didn't move, didn't flinch. She met his gaze with the same unshaken resolve she carried into every case she presided over. Only cowards fabricate evidence to silence their opponents. She replied, her voice calm but edged with steel. "You're afraid, Holt. That's why you had me set up." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Afraid? No, see. You still don't get it. You think this is about me? You think I need to be worried about someone like you?" He leaned in slightly, his smirk widening. "The people who run this system don't want you to win. You're fighting a war you already lost." She held his gaze, refusing to let his words sink into her bones. "If that were true, you wouldn't be here trying to convince me of it," she said. For the first time, something flickered in his expression. It was brief, barely noticeable, but it was there. A crack. Before he could respond, the door swung open again. "That's enough," a voice rang out. Marcus Fields strode into the room, his face hard with controlled anger. His suit was slightly wrinkled, His tie loosened just enough to suggest he had rushed here the moment he got the call. He stopped beside Olivia, his eyes locking onto Holt with a cold intensity. "You're going to release her?" Marcus said evenly. Holt pushed off the table with a slow grin. "Oh, and on what grounds?" Marcus didn't hesitate. He pulled a folder from the inside of his coat and tossed it onto the table between them. "On the grounds that this entire arrest was unlawful," Marcus said. "There's no forensic evidence linking her to the drugs you conveniently found." "The footage from the traffic camera?" "Yes. We already obtained it. Shows she wasn't speeding. That means this stop was bogus." "Which means," he leaned in, his voice dropping slightly, "you just made a very big mistake." For the first time, Holt's smirk faltered. He recovered quickly. But Olivia saw it, and so did Marcus. "You think waving some papers around changes anything?" Holt asked. Marcus smiled, but there was no humor in it. "No, but the press outside will. And they're waiting for a statement about why Judge Carter was unlawfully detained tonight." Holt's jaw tightened. A long silence stretched between them before he finally exhaled through his nose. Stepping back, he turned to the officers still lingering in the doorway. "Let her go." They hesitated but followed orders. One of them unlocked Olivia's cuffs. And the moment the metal slipped from her wrists, she stood, rolling her shoulders back. She didn't spare Holt another glance as she walked past him, Marcus close at her side. As they stepped out into the hallway, the air outside the holding cell felt fresher, lighter, but Olivia knew better than to mistake this for victory. "Are you okay?" Marcus asked as they made their way toward the exit. "I'm fine," she said, and she meant it, but she was done playing defense. By the time she reached her office the next morning, Olivia had already made her next move. She sat across from an investigative journalist she had known for years. A woman who had built her career exposing corruption, even when it put her own safety at risk. "Holt isn't the problem," Olivia told her. "He's a symptom. There's a system protecting him. And we need to find out who's behind it." The journalist leaned forward, intrigued. "Do you have anything solid?" Olivia slid a flash drive across the table. Video evidence of Holt using excessive force. Complaints that were buried. Names of people who covered for him. She said, "It's not enough to take him down completely. But it's a start." The journalist picked up the drive, weighing it in her palm. "If I run this, things are going to escalate." Olivia met her gaze. "They already have." The woman nodded. "I'll look into it." As Olivia left the office, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She hesitated before answering. "You're making a mistake," a male voice said. She didn't recognize it, but the tone was unmistakable. A warning. She ended the call without responding, gripping the phone tighter. She had expected retaliation. She had expected resistance. But what she hadn't expected was what came next. Because by that evening, a police officer, one who had once spoken out against Holt, was found dead. And Olivia knew, without a doubt, that the war had only just begun. The city was still waking up when Olivia arrived at the downtown law office. The streets were lined with coffee carts, early commuters, and the occasional jogger braving the cold morning air. But inside the conference room, the mood was far from routine. Seated across from her were 3 attorneys, veterans in civil rights litigation. They had built their careers taking on cases that others wouldn't touch, exposing corruption that many were too afraid to confront. One of them, an older black man with sharp eyes and a weary expression, leaned forward. "You're not just going after a bad cop," he said. "You're challenging an entire system that's designed to protect men like Holt." Olivia nodded. "I know, and that's exactly why we have to be smart about it." Marcus Fields was beside her, flipping through a folder filled with documents. "We're not just looking at Holt's personal misconduct. We're following the money. We believe there are officials within the department covering for him. People who have helped him stay on the force despite numerous complaints." A younger attorney, a woman in her mid-30s, crossed her arms. "You think you can prove it?" Olivia exchanged a look with Marcus before answering. "We're getting closer. But Holt isn't going to let this go without a fight. And neither will the people protecting him." The room fell silent for a moment. Finally, the older attorney exhaled, rubbing his chin. "All right," he said. "If we're doing this, we do it right. That means airtight legal arguments, media coverage, and, most importantly, pressure." We need to make it clear that this isn't just about one officer. It's about an entire culture of corruption. Olivia felt the weight of their words. But she also felt something else. Momentum. A week later, the courthouse was packed. It was supposed to be a routine pre-trial hearing. Nothing more than a procedural step before Holt's case went to trial. But everyone in the room knew better. This was the first real test. The air was thick with anticipation as Olivia took her seat at the bench. She scanned the crowd. Reporters filled the back rows, their cameras and notepads ready. Members of the community had come, too. Some looking hopeful, others skeptical. And then there was Holt. He entered the courtroom with the same smug confidence he had carried since the beginning. His uniform was crisp, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He carried himself like a man who had never known consequences. But as he took his seat at the defendant's table, something shifted. He could feel it, the weight of the evidence, the presence of the press, the sense that, for the first time, he wasn't in control of the narrative. Olivia let the silence stretch before speaking. "Officer Holt," she began, her voice steady, "do you believe that the system will protect you forever?" Holt smirked, leaning back in his chair. "I don't need to believe. It already has." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Olivia didn't blink. Not today. She turned her attention to the witness stand. "Call your first witness." The doors at the back of the room opened, and a uniformed officer stepped forward. Richard Lawson. There was a shift in the energy of the room. Lawson was a respected figure in law enforcement, a man known for playing by the rules. If he was testifying against one of his own, it meant something. He took his oath and sat down, his face unreadable. Olivia's attorney approached. "Officer Lawson, can you confirm that you reviewed Officer Holt's reports from the past 5 years?" "Yes. And in your review, did you find any inconsistencies?" A pause. Then, "Yes." Lawson reached into his jacket and pulled out a stack of documents. "These are copies of reports filed by Officer Holt. In several cases, the official statements contradict video evidence and eyewitness testimonies. In one instance, a suspect was listed as resisting arrest, despite body cam footage showing otherwise." A ripple of tension spread through the room. Olivia watched Holt from the bench. His jaw tightened. She had seen that expression before. Pressure. Holt's attorney shifted uncomfortably. "Objection. Overruled," Olivia said before they could finish. "Continue." Lawson turned the page. "Additionally, internal complaints against Officer Holt were dismissed under questionable circumstances. Many of these complaints never even reached formal review." The weight of the words settled over the courtroom. For the first time, Holt looked uneasy. Then, in a flash, he was on his feet. "You've got to be kidding me," he snapped, his voice cutting through the silence. His attorney grabbed his arm, whispering for him to sit down. But Holt wasn't listening. His face was red, his composure slipping. "You think you can put me on trial for doing my job?" he spat, his glare fixed on Olivia. "This is a joke." Olivia stayed perfectly still. "Sit down, Officer Holt." But he didn't. Instead, before anyone could react, he moved 2 strides and he was at the judge's bench, his fist slamming down on the polished wood. Gasps erupted from the gallery. A security officer lunged forward. But Olivia didn't flinch. She simply looked up at him, unshaken. "Thank you for proving my point," she said, her voice calm. The room exploded in noise. Cameras flashed. Reporters scribbled furiously. And Holt? He finally realized what he had done. Too late. The bailiff grabbed his arm, pulling him back as officers swarmed in. Holt struggled for a moment. But he knew. He had just given them exactly what they needed. Real evidence of who he really was. As they dragged him out of the courtroom, Olivia turned her attention back to the room. The system had protected Holt for years. But not anymore. The courtroom was frozen in stunned silence. Holt, still seething, stood in the center of the chaos he had just created. His outburst had been raw, reckless. His rage had cracked through the careful facade he had always maintained. And now, there was no undoing it. For a brief moment, no one moved. The officers stationed around the room exchanged glances. Uncertain, some hesitated, their hands hovering near their belts, unsure whether they were meant to act or stand down. Others stayed rigid, their training at war with their instincts. Then, Richard Lawson stepped forward. "Officer Holt," he said, his voice steady, "you are under arrest for assaulting a judge." Holt's eyes darted to the officers beside him, searching for someone. Anyone who would step in and protect him like they always had. But the hesitation in their stance told him everything he needed to know. This time, he was alone, his face twisted in fury. "You dare arrest me? I'm the goddamn police." Lawson didn't flinch, not anymore. He signaled to two officers, and they stepped forward, moving cautiously. Holt let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "This is a joke. You think they're gonna let this stand? You think I don't have people in my corner?" He turned toward Olivia, his hands still clenched into fists. "You think you won?" She stood behind the bench, steady despite the chaos still crackling in the air. She didn't react to the venom in his voice, didn't even blink. When she finally spoke, her words were measured, deliberate. "No, Holt," she said, "I think you lost." The room erupted. Reporters pushed forward, cameras flashing, pens scribbling frantically across notebooks. The murmurs from the crowd swelled into an uproar, a mixture of shock, satisfaction, and disbelief. Olivia could hear someone repeating the words under their breath, "He lost," as if saying it aloud made it real. The officers moved in, securing Holt's hands behind his back. He resisted at first, his breath heavy, but the fight in him had already begun to fade. The moment the cold steel of the handcuffs clicked shut, something in the room shifted. A man who had terrorized so many for so long had finally been brought down by his own arrogance. And everyone had seen it. Within hours, the footage was everywhere. The video of Holt's outburst, his attempt to intimidate Olivia, his arrest. All of it spread across news channels and social media like wildfire. The headline on every major network replayed the moment over and over. "Disgraced officer arrested after violent outburst in court." By the time Olivia returned to her office that evening, her phone had been ringing non-stop. Some calls were from journalists seeking a statement. Others were from colleagues, allies, and, inevitably, a few threats from those who saw Holt's fall as an attack on the police force itself. She ignored most of them. There was still work to do. Marcus Fields was already waiting for her when she walked in. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "The floodgates just opened," he said, tossing a manila folder onto her desk. She picked it up and flipped it open. The contents made her breath hitch. "Financial records. Where did you get this?" she asked, skimming the pages. "A whistleblower inside internal affairs," Marcus said. Holt wasn't just using his badge to get away with violence. He was getting paid for it. Olivia frowned, scanning the numbers. "Paid by whom?" Marcus leaned forward, tapping a name highlighted in one of the documents. "Deputy Commissioner James Calloway." She looked up sharply. "Calloway? The same Calloway who's been making public statements about rooting out corruption in the department?" "The very same," Marcus confirmed. Olivia exhaled, closing the folder. Holt had never been the endgame. He had been a symptom, not the disease. And now, they had the proof to go after the people who had made him untouchable in the first place. By morning, the pressure on the police department had reached a breaking point. City officials scrambled to distance themselves from Holt. The department issued a carefully worded statement about conducting an internal review. But it was too late. The case had outgrown them. A formal investigation was announced into Deputy Commissioner Calloway's financial dealings. Reporters began asking questions the department wasn't ready to answer. And for the first time, those who had hidden behind their power were starting to feel the walls close in. Olivia watched the news unfold from her office, her fingers wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. But today, the system had cracked, and she intended to keep pushing until it shattered completely. The morning after Holt's arrest, the backlash began. Olivia knew it was coming. She sat in her office, the faint hum of a news broadcast playing from a small television mounted on the wall. The screen flickered with footage from the courtroom. Holt's outburst. His face twisted in fury. The moment his badge no longer protected him. The clip played on repeat across major networks. But not everyone saw it as justice. A conservative news anchor on the screen leaned forward, his tone full of righteous indignation. "This is what happens when we let radical activists control the courts," he said, Officer Holt is a decorated policeman who dedicated his life to protecting this city. And now, he's being persecuted for doing his job. Olivia exhaled through her nose. Shaking her head, Marcus Fields stood near her desk, flipping through a stack of papers. They're spinning it exactly how we expected, he muttered. Holt's suddenly a victim of the system he spent years abusing. She leaned back in her chair. And the department? They're doing damage control, Marcus said. Officially, they've distanced themselves from him. Unofficially, some of his former colleagues are already working to soften the charges. They're pushing for a plea deal. Lesser sentence. No jail time. She let out a humorless laugh. Of course they are. It gets worse. Marcus slid a tablet across the desk. Olivia glanced at the screen, her expression darkening as she read the headline. Protests planned over officer's arrest. A war against police. They're rallying people, Marcus said. Some groups are calling it a witch hunt. There are even whispers of a Blue Lives Matter march right outside the courthouse. Olivia rubbed her temples. They weren't just fighting Holt anymore. They were fighting the entire system that refused to let people like him fall. She straightened in her chair. Then we need something they can't ignore. Real evidence. Hard proof that takes this beyond Holt and exposes the people backing him. Marcus nodded. I was thinking the same thing. He paused. I might have a lead. Olivia arched a brow. There's a cop, Marcus said, worked with Holt for years. Kept his mouth shut all this time. But apparently, he's been watching the way this is unfolding. And now, he might be willing to talk. She narrowed her eyes. What's his name? Detective Daniel Ortiz. The meeting was arranged in secrecy. Late at night, in a parking garage just outside the city. Olivia and Marcus waited inside Marcus's car. The dim glow of overhead lights cast long shadows on the concrete. The air thick with tension. Then, footsteps. Detective Daniel Ortiz emerged from the darkness. His posture stiff, his hands shoved into the pockets of his worn leather jacket. He glanced around nervously before stepping toward the car. Olivia rolled down the window. Detective Ortiz? He hesitated, then nodded. You got 5 minutes. Marcus gestured toward the passenger seat. Get in. Talk fast. Ortiz hesitated before climbing inside. He smelled of cheap coffee and stress. I don't know why I'm doing this, he muttered, rubbing his face. I must be out of my damn mind. Olivia watched him carefully. You've been part of this department for a long time, haven't you? Too long, he admitted. And you worked with Holt? Ortiz let out a bitter chuckle. Yeah, worked with him, covered for him, kept my head down while he did whatever the hell he wanted. He turned to face her. I ain't proud of it. But back then, speaking up wasn't an option. You either played along or you got pushed out. Why now? Marcus asked. Ortiz exhaled. Because I see where this is going. Holt's just the beginning, right? You're not stopping with him. Olivia nodded. Not even close. Ortiz glanced around the garage again, lowering his voice. Then you need to understand something. Holt, he's not just some rogue cop. He's part of something bigger. Marcus frowned. What do you mean? Ortiz hesitated. Then, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn flash drive. He handed it to Olivia. This, he said, this is what they don't want you to find. Olivia turned the drive over in her hands. What's on it? Financial records, Ortiz said. Bank transfers, shell accounts. Money moving in and out of places it shouldn't be. Holt was getting paid, but not just for silence. He was protecting people. Marcus tensed. Who? Ortiz swallowed hard. There's a group inside the department. Not officially, but they exist. They call themselves the Brotherhood. Olivia's stomach twisted. I heard rumors for years. Ortiz continued. But it wasn't until I started looking at Holt's money trail that I realized just how deep it goes. This isn't just a few bad cops covering for each other. It's a network. They operate like a damn secret society. They manipulate cases, make evidence disappear, and if someone steps out of line? He trailed off, shaking his head. Then they disappear too. Olivia finished. Ortiz nodded. Yeah, he sighed. Look, I ain't no hero. I'm telling you this because I'm tired. I spent my whole career looking the other way. Maybe this is my way of making things right. A long silence stretched between them. Then, Olivia reached into her bag and pulled out a business card. "This is my personal number," she said. "If you get any more information, you call me." Ortiz took it but didn't promise anything. Instead, he reached for the door handle. "Be careful," he muttered. "If you dig too deep, they'll come for you." Then, he was gone, disappearing into the night. Marcus turned to Olivia. "You believe him?" She tightened her grip on the flash drive. "I believe we just found our next move." But neither of them expected what happened next. Because the very next morning, Detective Ortiz was found beaten unconscious in an alley. And suddenly, the war Olivia had been fighting felt a whole lot bigger. The rhythmic beeping of hospital monitors filled the dimly lit room. The sterile scent of antiseptic lingered in the air, mixing with the faint traces of blood still drying on the bandages wrapped around Detective Ortiz's face. His right eye was swollen shut, his lip split, and bruises ran along the side of his jaw. Olivia stood near the foot of the hospital bed, her arms crossed, her face unreadable. Next to her, Marcus Fields scrolled through messages on his phone. Barely glancing up, Ortiz shifted slightly, wincing. "I should have known this would happen," he muttered. Olivia's gaze didn't waver. "Who did this?" He let out a humorless chuckle. "Like they left a calling card?" He shook his head, staring at the ceiling. "Two guys, ski masks, jumped me in the parking lot outside my apartment. Didn't take my wallet, didn't say much, just did what they came to do." Marcus finally looked up. "What did they say?" Ortiz hesitated, then exhaled. "One of them leaned in before they left. Told me to keep my mouth shut. That next time, I wouldn't be so lucky." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken truths. They all knew what this was. A warning. Marcus rubbed his temple. "We can get you protection." Ortiz let out a dry laugh. "You think a couple of uniforms outside my door will stop them?" "They are the uniforms." Olivia stepped closer. "That's why you have to testify." Ortiz turned his head, his good eye narrowing. "Are you insane? I barely made it out of that alley alive." "That's exactly why," Olivia said, "because they're afraid. You know something important. Otherwise, they wouldn't have gone this far." His jaw tightened. "You don't get it. I've seen this before. The department doesn't like loose ends. You step out of line, you disappear. Maybe not literally, but they'll ruin you. They'll frame you, discredit you, make sure no one ever believes a word you say again. Or worse." Olivia held his gaze. "And if you stay quiet? Then what? You go back to looking over your shoulder for the rest of your life?" Ortiz swallowed hard. "You said you were tired," she continued, her voice softer now. "That this was your chance to make things right. Well, this is it. You don't just have to speak up. You have to do it where it matters." The muscles in his jaw twitched. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, finally, he let out a breath and gave a single nod. "I'll testify." Later that night, Marcus sat at his desk, the glow of his laptop screen illuminating the dark office. The city outside was quiet, but his mind wasn't. He had been digging through the files from Holt's case, searching for something, anything, that could solidify their argument in court. What he found instead made his stomach turn. It was a bank ledger. Dozens of transactions, large sums of money moving between untraceable accounts, hidden behind layers of shell corporations. But the names attached to them? That was the real discovery. Holt was just a piece of the puzzle. The ledger listed other officers, city officials, even members of the district attorney's office. People who had been on the payroll of something far bigger than just one corrupt cop. Marcus leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. "Jesus Christ." Olivia, seated across from him, exhaled sharply. "This isn't just about Holt." "No," Marcus said grimly, "it never was." They stared at the list of names in silence. Among them, one stood out. Deputy Commissioner James Calloway. Marcus pointed at the name. "This is the guy pulling the strings. The Brotherhood, the money, Holt. It all traces back to him." Olivia's fingers tightened into a fist. "Then we go after him next." Marcus gave her a look. "You know what that means, right? Holt was small time compared to this. Calloway has real power. And real power means real accountability." Olivia said. Marcus sighed. "You're really not gonna let this go, are you?" "No," she said, standing up. "And neither should you." Just then, Olivia's phone buzzed. Blocked number. She hesitated, then answered. A distorted voice came through the speaker. Calm, calculated. You need to stop. Judge Carter. Her grip on the phone tightened. Who is this? A beat of silence. You keep pushing, and there won't be a case left to try. The call disconnected. Olivia slowly lowered the phone. Marcus frowned. What? She met his gaze. That was our next warning. Neither of them said it, but they both knew. This wasn't just about Holt anymore. This was war. The envelope was waiting for her when she arrived home. It sat on her doorstep. An unassuming manila folder. No return address. No markings. But the second Olivia picked it up, a chill crawled up her spine. She carried it inside, locking the door behind her. The house was quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator. She took a steadying breath, sat at the kitchen table, and opened the envelope. Inside was a single photograph. Her nephew, Jaden, taken that morning, outside his school. He was smiling, oblivious, his backpack slung over one shoulder as he walked toward the front entrance. Below the image, a short message was scrawled in red ink. Stop now, or he pays the price. Olivia clenched the edges of the paper, her breath coming short and sharp. This was different. The threats before had been vague, meant to intimidate her into backing down. This was personal. She forced herself to think rationally. The people behind this weren't going to act yet. If they wanted to hurt Jaden, they wouldn't have sent a warning. This was fear tactics. They wanted her rattled. She pulled out her phone and dialed Marcus. We have a problem, she said as soon as he picked up. Where are you? Home, she said. I need you here, now. 20 minutes later, Marcus was pacing her living room, the photograph clenched in his hand. This is escalation, he muttered. They're not just trying to silence you in court anymore. They're making it personal. Olivia exhaled, pressing her fingers to her temple. I need Jaden out of town. I'll call my sister. Tell her to take him somewhere safe for a while. Marcus nodded. Good, but we need to hit back. Hard. Just then, the sound of shattering glass rang through the house. Olivia and Marcus both spun toward the front window. A brick lay on the floor, surrounded by shards of glass. Marcus lunged forward, pushing aside the curtains to peer outside. A black sedan was speeding away down the street. He cursed under his breath, then picked up the brick. A piece of paper was wrapped around it. Unfolding it, he read the words aloud. You can't win. An hour later, Olivia and Marcus sat in his office, going through the files again. Marcus leaned back, rubbing his face. They're getting desperate. Olivia, that means we're close to something big. She nodded. But what? Marcus turned his laptop toward her. I think I found it. She scanned the screen, eyes narrowing as she took in the details. Deputy Commissioner James Calloway. His name appeared in multiple places. Bank transfers, sealed disciplinary files, confidential memos. He's the one, Marcus said. Calloway has been pulling the strings this whole time. He's the reason Holt was untouchable for so long. Every time there was a complaint against him, Calloway made it disappear. Olivia tapped the screen. And look at this. Money transfers from private security firms. Off-the-books payments. He's not just covering up police misconduct. He's running a full-scale operation. This isn't just about Holt. This is an entire system built to keep men like him protected. Marcus exhaled. If we bring him down, we expose everything. She looked at him. Then we make our move. Marcus hesitated. There's one more thing. He pulled up another screen, showing flight records. Calloway booked a one-way ticket to Dubai. Tomorrow morning. Olivia's stomach dropped. He's running. Marcus nodded. And if he gets away, we lose our best shot at taking down the whole network. Olivia's grip tightened around the edge of the desk. Then we stop him before he can leave. But before they could plan their next step, Marcus's phone buzzed. His face paled as he read the message. He looked up at Olivia, his voice grim. Something just happened. Something big. The news broke at dawn. Deputy Commissioner James Calloway, the man who had built an empire of corruption within the police force, was dead, shot twice in the chest, once in the head, execution style. By the time Olivia and Marcus arrived at the scene, the area was already swarming with officers and forensic teams. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the sleek glass windows of Calloway's high-rise apartment. painting the streets in shifting shades of chaos. They stood behind the crime scene tape, watching as a stretcher carrying the body was loaded into an unmarked van. Marcus let out a low whistle. Didn't even make it to the airport. Olivia didn't respond. She was scanning the scene, taking in the details. No shattered windows, no signs of forced entry. The door had been locked when first responders arrived. A professional job. She turned to Marcus. Whoever did this wasn't just trying to kill him. They were tying up loose ends. Marcus exhaled. We need to find out who pulled the trigger before the department buries this. Before either of them could move, a voice called out, Judge Carter. They turned. Captain Howard, one of the department's senior officers, approached with measured steps, his face unreadable. We're handling this, ma'am. I suggest you let us do our jobs. Olivia met his gaze. Handling it how? Because this wasn't a robbery. No matter what the official report says. Howard didn't blink. The evidence says otherwise. Calloway's safe was open. Valuables missing. Looks like a botched burglary. Marcus scoffed. You and I both know that's a load of. Olivia put a hand on his arm, silencing him. She kept her voice level. This was a hit. Calloway knew too much, and someone made sure he couldn't talk. Howard's lips pressed into a thin line. And what exactly are you implying? Judge Carter? She took a step forward. That maybe the same people who protected Holt were protecting Calloway, and now that we're closing in, they're eliminating anyone who can connect the dots. A long silence. Then Howard smirked. Careful, Judge. That sounds an awful lot like a conspiracy theory. Olivia didn't flinch. Then prove me wrong. Howard held her gaze a second longer before turning on his heel and walking away. Marcus muttered under his breath. That guy's full of it. Olivia kept her eyes on Howard's retreating figure. He's scared. Marcus frowned. Of what? She exhaled, watching the body van disappear down the street. Of whoever's next. The attack came from all sides. Within hours, Olivia's name was being dragged through the mud. News segments speculated about her involvement in Calloway's death. A headline flashed across the screen in Marcus's office as they watched in disbelief. Judge Carter's investigation takes deadly turn. Was this retaliation? Marcus threw the remote onto his desk. This is insane. They're making it sound like you put a hit out on Calloway. Olivia folded her arms. This is exactly what they want. Distract the public. Shift the blame. Make me look like the threat. She was used to scrutiny. But this was something else entirely. The phone on Marcus's desk rang. He answered, listened for a moment, then let out a string of curses before hanging up. That was the DA's office. He said, they want me off the case. Effective immediately. Olivia's jaw tightened. They're pulling you? Marcus nodded. They're saying it's too dangerous. That after Calloway's murder. This case is getting out of hand. But we both know what this really is. They want you to stop. They don't want me to stop. Olivia, Marcus said quietly. They want us to stop. Silence settled between them. Then Olivia's phone vibrated. A text message. A single line. Walk away. This is bigger than you. She stared at the screen for a long moment. Then looked up at Marcus. They're right about one thing. She said, this is bigger than us. Marcus frowned. So what do we do? Olivia took a breath, her voice firm. We take it to the people. The cameras flashed like a thunderstorm. The press conference room inside City Hall was packed wall to wall. Reporters elbowing each other for space. Microphones lined up in front of Olivia like weapons poised for battle. The tension in the air was thick, the kind that settled before a storm broke loose. Olivia stood at the podium, her back straight, hands resting firmly on the wooden surface. She had faced countless trials in her career. But this was different. This time, she wasn't delivering a verdict. She was setting the record straight for the entire world to hear. She took a breath and began. For weeks now, I have been investigating corruption within our city's police department. What started as an inquiry into Officer Travis Holt has revealed something far more sinister, an entrenched system of abuse, bribery, and obstruction of justice that extends to the highest levels of law enforcement. Murmurs rippled through the room. Cameras zoomed in. She continued. Deputy Commissioner James Calloway was a key player in this system. He protected violent officers like Holt, ensuring they never faced consequences. He laundered money, obstructed investigations, and silenced those who threatened to expose him. And just as we were closing in, he was murdered. Silence. His death was no coincidence. Olivia said, it was a message. She turned to the screen behind her, where a slideshow of documents appeared. Transaction records, internal emails, signed authorizations, all linking Calloway and his network of enforcers to secret offshore accounts. This, she said, gesturing at the evidence, is how they maintained their power. This is what they didn't want you to see. Marcus, standing near the edge of the room, watched as the weight of Olivia's words settled over the crowd. He had warned her that going public would make her a target. But he also knew there was no turning back. The livestream counter ticked higher and higher, tens of thousands watching. Then hundreds of thousands. The truth was out, and it couldn't be ignored. Then Olivia delivered the final blow. In these files, you'll find a list of names, officers, city officials, even members of the judiciary, who were complicit, who took money to keep this system in place. And today, I am calling for a full-scale federal investigation into every single one of them. The room exploded into chaos. Reporters shouted over one another. News channels scrambled to break the story. The truth was no longer just a courtroom matter, it was a national crisis. Marcus leaned toward Olivia, speaking just loud enough for her to hear. You just set the city on fire. She didn't blink. Good. The retaliation came faster than she expected. An hour after the press conference, Olivia's phone buzzed with an unknown number. She didn't recognize the voice on the other end. But the message was clear. You don't deserve to live. She hung up. Minutes later, Marcus received a call from a contact inside the police department. Holt made bail. Marcus went still. When? An hour ago. And he didn't go home. A cold feeling settled in his chest. Then where is he? The line went dead. Olivia was leaving City Hall when she saw him. Travis Holt, standing just beyond the barricades of reporters and onlookers. His face twisted with something between rage and exhilaration. His badge was gone. His uniform was gone. But his arrogance? That was still there. And in his hand, he held a gun. The world seemed to slow. A dozen things happened at once. People screamed. Cameras flashed. Officers moved. But none of it mattered. All Olivia saw was Holt raising the weapon, his finger tightening on the trigger. Then, the gun fired. A crack of thunder, deafening in its finality. For a split second, Olivia thought she had been hit. But then she saw Marcus stumble beside her, his eyes wide with shock. Blood spread across his shirt. Olivia lunged forward, catching him before he collapsed completely. Marcus gasped, gripping her arm, his breath coming in sharp, ragged bursts. Holt smirked, but before he could fire again, a swarm of officers tackled him to the ground. The gun clattered against the pavement. Chaos erupted. People ran. Sirens screamed. Hands pressed against Marcus's wound, trying to slow the bleeding. Olivia held onto him, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. Stay with me, she whispered, gripping his hand. Marcus, stay with me. His lips parted like he wanted to say something. But no words came. His eyelids fluttered, and then his body went limp. Olivia's scream cut through the night. Holt lay on the pavement, his face pressed against the cold concrete as officers restrained him. The gun had been kicked away, now lying useless under the flashing red and blue lights. His breath came in ragged gasps. His hands twisted behind his back, wrists locked in steel cuffs. For the first time, he wasn't the one in control. A sea of voices roared behind the barricades. Crowds gathered outside City Hall, their chants echoing through the streets. Justice for Marcus. No more corrupt cops. Hold them all accountable. Phones were raised high, recording every second of Holt's downfall. The footage of him raising the gun. The moment the shot rang out. The chaos that followed. It had already spread across social media. And this time, there was no way to twist the narrative. This wasn't just another police shooting swept under the rug. This wasn't an internal investigation that would conveniently clear Holt of wrongdoing. The world had seen him for what he was. Richard Lawson, his jaw clenched, leaned down and tightened the cuffs. You're done, Holt. Holt sneered, his voice low and bitter. You think this changes anything? He exhaled a harsh laugh. You really think I was the only one? Lawson yanked him to his feet. Doesn't matter. You're going to rot in a cell for the rest of your life. But Holt only grinned, his eyes dark with something Olivia couldn't quite place. You don't get it, do you? He turned his head slightly, looking right at her. You took me down, but the system? It's still here. Olivia's spine stiffened, but she didn't let him see her waver. And now, the system knows we're coming for it. Holt's smirk faltered just a fraction. She held his gaze. Enjoy prison. The officers pulled him toward the squad car, pushing his head down as they forced him inside. The door slammed shut, and just like that, it was over. Or so she thought. The trial moved quickly, with overwhelming evidence, multiple witnesses, and the undeniable footage of him attempting to murder Olivia in broad daylight. The prosecution barely had to fight. The defense tried everything. Claims of mental instability, accusations of political bias, even last-ditch efforts to frame Marcus's death as self-defense. None of it worked. When the verdict was read, Olivia sat in the judge's chair, watching as Holt stood, expression blank, the weight of his sentence settling on his shoulders. Travis Holt, the judge intoned, this court finds you guilty on all counts, including attempted murder, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit multiple felonies. You are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. There was no gasp of shock in the courtroom, no protests. The only sound was the finality of the gavel striking wood. Holt closed his eyes for a brief moment. Then, as he was escorted away, he turned his head toward Olivia, his lips curling into a whisper of a smile. And that was what unsettled her the most. That evening, Olivia sat in her office, exhaustion settling deep in her bones. She had won. She had dismantled Holt. She had cracked open a corrupt system, forcing the world to look. So why didn't it feel finished? A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. A court clerk stepped inside, holding a small envelope. This was just delivered for you. Olivia frowned. From who? The clerk shrugged. No return address. She hesitated a second before taking it, waiting until the door shut before sliding a finger under the seal. A single slip of paper inside. No signature. No threats. Just one line. Holt was just a pawn. The game isn't over. A chill ran through her. She turned the note over, searching for anything more, but there was nothing. Only the heavy silence of her office. Only the realization that this battle was far from finished. The verdict had been delivered. The headlines blared Holt's conviction. The people celebrated. And yet, Olivia Carter couldn't shake the unease settling deep in her chest. She sat in her office, the city skyline glowing in the twilight beyond the window. The air carried a deceptive calm, the kind that masked a storm lurking beneath. Papers were stacked neatly on her desk. Reports of resignations from high-ranking officers, abrupt retirements, quiet exits from those who had once protected men like Holt. But Olivia knew better than to believe the system had truly changed. Marcus, still recovering, leaned against the doorway. The bandages beneath his shirt were hidden, but the exhaustion in his eyes wasn't. You did it, he said. Holt's gone. His network is crumbling. Olivia exhaled. Is it? He frowned. What do you mean? She tapped a file on her desk. Holt was just one officer. Calloway was just one name. And now, we're seeing something strange. These resignations. These sudden retirements. They're not admissions of guilt. Marcus. They're strategies. Marcus rubbed his jaw. They're regrouping. Exactly. Olivia stood, pacing to the window. Power never disappears. It shifts. It adapts. Marcus watched her carefully. So what do we do? She turned to face him. We stay ahead of them. That night, Olivia received the message. It came through an unlisted number. Just 2 sentences. Don't think this is over. We're watching. No signature. No traceable source. She read it twice, then set her phone down without reacting. She had expected this. She had shaken the system. But it wasn't broken. The old guard was retreating. But something new was rising to take its place. She didn't flinch, didn't panic. Instead, she picked up the latest case files that had been left on her desk. Another officer accused of excessive force. Another story of cover-ups and silence. The cycle was trying to repeat itself. And this time, Olivia wouldn't just play defense. She grabbed her coat and stepped out of her office. The hallway was quiet. But as she walked toward the exit, she saw them. Journalists, attorneys, activists, people who had watched her fight, who had believed in what she started. They weren't here for closure. They were here to keep going. Olivia met their eyes, took a breath, and stepped forward. The battle wasn't over. But now, she wasn't fighting alone. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the wet pavement. The familiar hum of a police radio crackled in the background. A black man sat in his car, hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. His jaw locked as an officer loomed outside his window. "License and registration," the officer said, his voice carrying the same cold authority that had haunted so many encounters like this. But this time, something was different. A woman standing on the sidewalk pulled out her phone, recording. A journalist from a local news station was already on the scene. Microphone in hand, a lawyer in a navy suit stepped forward, watching closely, and then, a second patrol car arrived. The officer inside barely glanced at his colleague before stepping out and addressing the situation calmly. "Everything okay here?" he asked, his tone neutral but firm. The first officer hesitated, his grip tightening on his belt. His eyes flicked to the people watching. The phones, the news crew, the lawyer. A long pause. Then, almost reluctantly, he took a step back. "You can go," he muttered, waving the driver off. The man in the car let out a shaky breath, turned the key, and pulled away. The journalist lowered her microphone, turning to the lawyer beside her. "Did that just happen?" The lawyer nodded. "Yeah, it did. Somewhere. Someone uploaded the footage. Somewhere. Another conversation began. And somewhere else." Olivia Carter watched the scene unfold on a news broadcast. It wasn't justice. Not yet. But it was something. Outside the courthouse, a crowd gathered. Signs waved in the air. Voices rose in unity, demanding change. What had started as outrage over one case had become something more. A movement refusing to be silenced. From the courthouse steps, Olivia looked over them all. She had fought for this. She had bled for this. And still, she knew it wasn't enough. A reporter broke through the crowd. Microphone raised. "Judge Carter, what do you make of everything that's happened?" Olivia let the question hang in the air for a moment. Then, she smiled. "This is just the beginning," she said. She turned and walked up the courthouse steps, her heels clicking against the stone. But as she reached the doors, she felt it. A presence. A shadow in the distance. Lingering just out of sight. She didn't turn. Didn't react. She just stepped forward, pushing the doors open, knowing that the fight was far from over. Justice isn't a single moment. It's a fight that never truly ends. Olivia Carter may have won this battle, but the system she challenged still lurks in the shadows, adapting, waiting. So the real question is, who will stand up next? What do you think? Can corruption ever be fully erased? Or will it always find new ways to survive? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to Covert Truths for more stories that expose the truth. No matter how deep it's buried.